Hi everyone, welcome to Legal Professional Conduct Module 1. This is going to be an interesting subject because it's quite different from the other law subjects that you've studied so far, and I think the first video I made speaks a bit about that. The material for the first week really looks at the foundations of ethical practice, gives you some of the terminology, some of the tools to help understand the terminology around ethics, and I think frames the debates later on. And I like to think about ethics as a framework for decision making, or a scaffolding or a protection, because most of the ethical decisions that we have to make, and it's really about those key core decisions, most of the decisions we make are difficult not because it's a choice between right and wrong. It's not like the devil on one shoulder and the angel on another. It's not a choice between a good and bad decision. It's usually a choice between two good decisions. It's usually conflicting duties, conflicting standards, and situations where it's really quite difficult to decide which is the most right of the right decisions, the most correct. So the ethical framework, I think, just gives us a way of problem solving those kinds of ethical choices, of actually going through and making sure that we make those decisions in a structured way. We don't do it in a kind of an impulsive, intuitive kind of way that might get us in trouble later on, and might, not necessarily from external authorities, but because we just haven't thought through the angles. And one thing by now, at this stage in your study, you'll know is law is all about thinking about all the angles, thinking about all those different things that could go wrong further down the track. So yes, the subject does covers what happens if you steal your client's money and run off to the casino and gamble it all away. But I think you already know the answer to that, whether you should or shouldn't do that. And that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is what happens when you have a duty to a client and you have a duty to another client. What happens if there's a situation where you've got co-accused, and a student told me about one of these recently, where they were co-accused and their child was being used as an interpreter because their English language wasn't very good. It was a situation where they didn't have access to a professional interpreter. They didn't have time to get a professional interpreter, and you had a sort of a 10-year-old child interpreting for co-accused in a fairly serious criminal matter. And we will come back to that one, what the answer to that question is, because again, it's not an easy one, because obviously in a real ideal world it'd be really nice to be able to say, no, we'll wait and we'll get a professional interpreter and we'll make sure we have different counsel for each of the co-accused to make sure there's no conflict of interest there. But of course the world doesn't work that way. Okay, so another important key issue here is the idea of the profession. We talk a lot about that. It's one of those words that I think over time we've kind of lost value in. We talk about profession and people kind of talk about it in the same way they talk about a job, having a profession. However, a profession is something that is taken quite seriously, has an important public role, even though professions have sort of lost a lot of their public status. And the sociologist Max Weber was actually one of the key theorists to talk about the importance of professions. And he was writing in a time when we were emerging from basically the Middle Ages way of doing things, where everything was clannish and about connections, and decisions were made at whim or on the basis of quid pro quo, with favours owed and family connections and so on. And Weber said that professions are really, really important because they rise above that. They have a public status, and the status of the profession means that the profession is self-governing and self-regulating, and they mean that they act as an authority within themselves, as opposed to just doing a job where it's, well, they pay you, you do the job, and hopefully you do it in the right way, hopefully you do it in an ethical way, but there's no self-governance that goes on there. With a profession, and we're talking about things like medicine, we're talking about law. We used to talk about journalism in the same way. Very bizarre. When I started studying, there was a lot of talk about journalists' code of ethics and code of conduct. Today, very different, interesting situation. Although, there might be people studying journalism who have a different opinion. But for us, the legal profession is something that came out of a period where the law was basically a corrupt system. And the idea of a profession was to rise independently above that. How successful we've been, well, that's one of the issues to discuss this week. and we're going to look at not only about the public perception of the profession, but some of the changes that have been occurring. And that's a theme that's been running through our whole program, is that the legal profession is changing dramatically. And in the next few years, there's going to be increasing dramatic changes. And we are moving very quickly towards a model where pretty much, I guess, it's the lawyer that the model that pharmacists have moved to. They were once very professionally independent, and now the big chains like PriceRite are taking over. What is going to happen when most lawyers are employed on a casual basis on something like PriceRite, LawRite? What will that mean for professional standards? Probably nothing good, but as lawyers it's important that we keep on top of those things. And we also keep conscious of the public perceptions of law and why the public often is quite sceptical and quite cynical about lawyers, as you'll know from many lawyer jokes. I have my own pet theory about this, and it's to do with the notion of sequestration. And that's where, if someone deals with things that are unpleasant, you tend to transfer that unpleasantness to those people. So for years and years, people who worked who were garbos, who worked in sort of civic hygiene as cleaners or whatever, were kind of seen as dirty themselves because they worked with something that was dirty or unhealthy, and that transferred to sort of this sort of middle class idea of parts of the working class being immoral because of the contagion of the dirt that they worked with. Now, that's a different issue, but I think some of that applies to the way people see lawyers, because people only deal with lawyers really when the most unpleasant things happen in their lives. And that experience, I think, tends to make them project a lot of negative feelings. So, I mean, most people's connection with lawyers, unfortunately, is through family law. Very awful, stressful period for a lot of people. And I think the fact that they then have to pay someone to help them sort out their personal mess, it's very easy to then project a lot of those feelings and to say a lot of that horrible ugliness that went on in those fights were because those greedy lawyers were making money out of it, not because of the actual conflict that led to that situation. And the fact that if you're getting professionals in to help you sort your conflict out, you're going to have to pay them. And you're going to have to pay them fees. Now, that's not to totally exonerate lawyers, and again, we're going to talk at some of those problems and ethical problems in the profession, particularly about billable hours and so on, that have created problems. We have created problems for ourselves in some of these ways. But all those things are coming up. So this week we're really looking at underlying those theories of ethics, having a quick introduction to the codes, the professional codes, and they're in your notes, and then touching on what some of those major debates will be. So I think that this subject is an interesting one because it's a bit of a break from learning lots of hardcore, technical, crunchy legal principles, but it's also a point to sort of think about where we are and where we're going, and to think about yourself. How have your opinions changed from when you were a bright-eyed, fresh first-year student going out there wanting to change the world? And, how's that changed now that you're a cynical third-year student, hardened by the experience? Anyway, look forward to talking about that at the workshop session this week.